What exactly is a vulnerability? We talked about process of gaining access and making target execute our commands, but let us explain what happens once we exploit a vulnerability. Well, let's start like this. And trust me, if it sounds a little complicated, it will be more clear once we get to practical examples in the next few videos. For now, let's explain it like this. We know that developers write programs. They use their code, which can be written in any language, whether it is Python, Java, C, or some other language. The goal for developer is to create a software using a programming language. And as we mentioned, that software can be based on any language whatsoever. Once the software is complete and it goes through a few test checks and security checks, then that software gets deployed on machines and it can be ran from those machines. This can be any type of software, it doesn't matter. However, the problem occurs once that software is open to the internet. For example, FTP is open on some machines and servers for file transfer protocol. SSH could also be open for secure shell connection. HTTP could be open to host a web page that clients connect to. Basically, if your software is hosted on an open port, then it is also open for possible attacks from the outside. And as we already know that the software is consisted of code that developers wrote, problem occurs if that code is not well written, if it has some bugs. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that if there is a bug that we can exploit the target, but sometimes those bugs can be critical, and the attacker could use that bug to make software act in a way that it is not intended to. That's called exploitable vulnerability. Usually once exploited, we drop a payload or a shell back, so we can control that machine and do what we want with it. Once a bug or vulnerability is discovered, it gets that name that we've seen for vulnerabilities in NASA's that starts with CVE, and then the year of when the vulnerability first occurred. A vulnerability that exists and has not been patched yet by the vendors is called 0 day. Usually as soon as critical 0 day is discovered, it gets patched almost immediately, but you will see examples of 0 days that were used for months before anyone found out about them. The most known recent one was in 2017, when the WannaCry ransomware occurred and infected a bunch of hospitals and police stations. It was based on an exploit called Eternal Blue, which was created and used by NSA. They never reported it and used it for their attacks until those exploits got stolen from them and got leaked. We will see in this course a lot of recent 0 days that are now patched. Some of them will even be as recent as just a few months ago. However, all of this makes sense if the target has a vulnerability. But remember, vulnerabilities don't always have to be of technical nature. Imagine a company with a bunch of networks, servers and machines, fully secured and also protected by the best firewall. No security holes, no vulnerabilities. We can't even scan the target to figure out its infrastructure because its protection is so good. Now, imagine an employee that works there. Let's call him John. And let's focus on John at the moment. John likes cars. He usually searches for car pictures and videos while working. One day he gets an email from a person that has email name exactly the same as his colleague. In that email, there is a car picture. He sees that the email is coming from his colleague, so he doesn't question it. Therefore, he opens that picture at work, and it indeed is a car picture. But little does he know, that email was us spoofing an email for him, so that at the first glance it looks like it comes from his colleague, and that picture opened a car image, but it also ran our malicious program in the background. What happens next? Now, John's work computer is infected, and he doesn't even know it. And from his computer, we can compromise the entire network and the entire inside of that company. Now, this is just an example, but stuff like this happens a lot. Matter of fact, most of the hacking that happens that you read about happens this way, and not by someone finding a 0 day vulnerability on a fully secured company. Remember, people are always the weakest spot. So if you can hack something through them, why would you bother trying to discover a technical vulnerability that might not even be there? In the next video, we're only left to talk briefly about shells and different types of shells that we want to drop once exploiting the target. After that, we are ready to get our hands dirty and start gaining access to our target machine. See you in the next video. Okay, we already talked a little about this and we mentioned some vulnerabilities before, but right now let's dive a little deeper and explain which vulnerabilities exist and also give a demonstration of one in the next video and how to prevent it. So, in reality, battling against vulnerabilities is a battle on multiple fronts. Threat can come from anywhere and from anyone, and that's why there is a trust model in cybersecurity that is called zero trust. Essentially, it means to trust no one. Now, these vulnerabilities I decided to divide into two main categories. First one are software vulnerabilities, and of course this is a broad division, so we must divide it further down. Here are the most common software vulnerabilities. First one and most dangerous one is a zero-day vulnerability. We already mentioned it, and it is a vulnerability that has not been discovered yet and not patched. This type of a bug or a vulnerability is a constant threat to every organization that is on the internet. Another type that you will usually hear about are OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities. This is a set that developers should be introduced with and that should be applied for any web application security. If you are developing a web application, you should most likely be familiar with all of the top 10 OWASP vulnerabilities. These include injection type of vulnerabilities such as SQL injection, command injection, cross-site scripting attacks where JavaScript is injected into unsanitized user input. We also have broken access control attacks and many more. Usually, these vulnerabilities occur when user input is not well filtered, or they can also occur due to some type of misconfiguration in the application. Again, more about OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities you can check out inside ZTM Bug Bounty course. This leads us to another type of vulnerabilities which can occur from misconfigurations. This one is common since the larger the code that is used, the more chances that something is not configured right or implemented right. Remember, it's not one developer that writes entire code. Especially for bigger softwares, we have multiple developers, each of them has a assigned task, and they each devote to one specific task that they get. None of them really wonders too much about one thing being well configured with another thing, and that's where some type of misconfiguration can occur. And then this can lead to vulnerabilities which exploit these misconfigurations. They're also common in access control types of configurations. Perhaps you prevent employees from accessing a website configuration page, but you don't prevent them from accessing a different page which interacts with the website configuration page in a way that might allow the employee to change something. Again, this is broad division, as these types of vulnerabilities can occur really anywhere. Another danger comes from outdated software. Imagine a zero-day vulnerability comes out and everyone patches their systems to prevent it except you. You no longer are vulnerable to the zero-day vulnerability but to the outdated software vulnerability, since the patch is already out. That's why it's always important to patch every code and library that you have or that you have used whenever a bug is found. And last but not least, we have man-in-the-middle and DDoS attacks. Man-in-the-middle attacks can be prevented by certain network security measures, which we will talk about in the network security section of the course, but what man-in-the-middle essentially allows you to do is sniff others' traffic on the network. While years ago this was common and possible in almost every network, nowadays more and more security implementations against this are being done. Same goes with DDoS attacks. More and more denial-of-service attacks are being prevented with different security measures. Now, one thing I want to point out to anyone wondering where these attacks mostly come from, if I had to give you one advice, I would say always check the code where user input can be provided. This is the number one spot where these type of software vulnerabilities occur. Now, these do not include man-in-the-middle attack and denial-of-service attack, but all the others that we mentioned mostly occur due to invalid user input. Whenever a user input is provided in a place where that user can manipulate the code and make it do something that it isn't supposed to do, just remember, this is the number one spot where vulnerabilities occur. Whenever a user input is provided in a place where the user can manipulate the code and make it do something that it isn't supposed to be doing, that's a place where a vulnerability can occur. So just remember to always filter user input so that it only accepts exactly what you want it to accept, and we will actually see why this is important in the next section. Okay, but these are actually lesser common vulnerabilities that get exploited out in the open. The more common set of vulnerabilities is something I like to call human vulnerabilities. This is number one problem on the internet, since most people aren't educated enough to know what they should and shouldn't do on the internet. These human vulnerabilities include social engineering or phishing attacks, downloading unwanted software, opening unverified emails, which essentially means opening emails that appear to be coming from the trusted source, but in reality, they are not to be trusted at all. And another one is clicking on random links. All these can result into not only the employee of the company being compromised, but the entire company as well. This is where that zero trust model comes in play. Before, since the employee was behind a firewall and all the security measures of the company, and was a trusted node in the company's network, it was easier to exploit the entire network after actually getting access to that employee's machine, after, for example, running a social engineering attack. But with zero trust, none is to be trusted and you expect a threat to come from anywhere. Anyways, now that we know what vulnerabilities are we dealing with, let's take a look at an example of how attackers actually exploit one of these vulnerabilities when they see it. Okay, we saw an example of exploiting Windows 10 with a simple Trojan. We also saw an example of most simple phishing attack. But now, let's see how it looks like when we exploit an unpatched vulnerability, and you will see this can be rather dangerous. The main reason why this can be rather dangerous is because you will see right now how easy this can be achieved. So anyone with a little bit of knowledge can perform these attacks if they want to. So what we're going to do in this video is we're just going to demonstrate how to exploit target system if it has an unpatched vulnerability. Now don't worry, you don't need to know exactly what is happening in the background, just watch the process. We're watching this from the perspective of a hacker, just to understand how easy this can be. And if you're interested in actually learning all of these methods of hacking different systems and different machines, make sure you check out the ZTM Complete Ethical Hacking Bootcamp. There we explain all of these attacks. Nonetheless, I have my vulnerable virtual machine running. Its IP address is 192.168.1.5. So what a hacker would usually do is they would run a simple scan onto this IP to figure out whether it has any open ports on that machine. If it does have open ports, the attacker would usually go through the results of this scan, figure out what services are running on those open ports, and perhaps figure out whether they have been patched, or maybe they have an existing vulnerability because the owner of that machine forgot to patch those services. Now, this particular machine that we're attacking is purposely made vulnerable, so we already know that there will be a couple of vulnerabilities here. So here are the results of port scan with a tool called Nmap. And once again, if you have never encountered this, it can be rather confusing, but don't worry, you don't have to do anything throughout this lecture, just sit back and watch this demonstration. Now, let's start off with a simple vulnerability which results because owner of the target machine didn't update the default password. And in this particular exploit, we're going to target VNC, which is running on port 5900 over TCP. We can see that the port is open, and we can also see which protocol is it running. Now, an attacker would usually use a tool to run his exploits, and in this case, let me just enlarge this so we can see it. We're going to use a tool called MSF console to launch our exploit. And this is pretty much where the main danger comes from. See, the attacker doesn't really have to know what these exploits do. He only needs to know how to use them in order to successfully perform this attack. This is dangerous because someone with just a little bit of knowledge can perform this attack without actually knowing what they are doing. The MSF console has opened up, and for this particular exploit, we're going to use this module. Auxiliary, scanner, scanner for VNC, and we're going to use VNC login module. So we're going to try to log in over VNC. Let's see our available options, and pretty much everything we need to specify right here in order to run this module is the rhosts, and rhosts is just an IP address of the target machine. It will then use a password file supplied by this tool to try brute force the password of the target service. We can see the path to which file it is using, and right now, if we only set our hosts to the target IP and we click run, that's about it. It took half a second for this exploit to finish. It says starting VNC login sweep, and just a moment later we get login successful with the password. So the target didn't change the password. So what we can do right now is we can use this password to access the target system. Let me show you how you can do that. You can simply run a tool called Ramina, which will open this small window, and here all we have to do is select VNC, so not SSH, not RDP, we want to go VNC, and we're pretty much going to be able to get remote desktop on the target machine. We press IP, it asks for the password. We already know because of this module that the password is password. We press enter, and here is the terminal to the target machine. Now, it might be in a little smaller letters, so you might not be able to see it that easily, but this is pretty much a terminal on the target machine. If I run ifconfig, I can see the IP address of the target machine, which is 192.168.1.5. I can type who am I, which will tell me that I am root. So I pretty much have the root access on this target machine. You see how easy this was. Let's show another example of exploiting a vulnerable machine. So we're going to clear this and let's choose a different service, and for this let's use port 139, which is running Samba, this particular version. And what an attacker can do is they can just copy this version that they discovered, go on to Google, paste the version, and once they search this specific version, they might have something like this pop up. Samba username mapscript command execution, which is a vulnerability probably for this particular version that we googled. The attacker can then check which version it targets by reading the description of the exploit. We figure out that this exploit is actually in this MSF console tool, so we can load it straight away just by using these commands. So let's do it right now. Use exploit multi Samba, and then the name of the script, which is usermap script. We can type show info in order to read more about this. So it says this module exploits a command execution vulnerability in Samba version 3.0.20 through 3.0.25 when using the non-default usermap map script configuration option. And if we check which options we need to set in order to run this exploit, it only asks for the rhosts, which is once again the IP address of the target machine. So we can type set rhosts 192.168.1.5, type run, wait for a couple of seconds, and we get command shell session 1 opened on the target machine. Now you will notice nothing really popping up, but if I type who am I, once again I get the response that I'm root on the target machine. I can confirm by typing ifconfig, which will give me the IP address of 192.168.1.5, which is exactly the IP address of this virtual machine, or should I say vulnerable virtual machine. And this was just a demonstration of two different exploits. Of course, in real life, it would be much harder to exploit a target system because it's highly unlikely that it contains this many vulnerabilities that this vulnerable virtual machine that we targeted had, but you still get the point. Sometimes it can be rather easy to exploit a machine. That's why it's important we learn how to protect ourselves against these types of vulnerabilities. So in the next lecture, let's talk about how we can prevent vulnerabilities. Okay, so we talked about different types of vulnerabilities, malwares, hackers, and all of that, and we also showed some simple examples of exploiting and unpatched vulnerabilities, examples of running phishing attacks, and examples of executing a simple malware on a Windows machine. But all of this wouldn't make much of a sense if we don't also talk about ways that we can prevent all of these. Now, most of the stuff that we will mention in this lecture will have their own lectures and sections where we explain them in more detail. Nonetheless, let's mention what are the basic things we can do to stop the hacker exploiting vulnerabilities. So let's take unpatched vulnerability example first. The attacker scans our device. He finds out that there is an outdated software or service running on an open port on our machine, and he runs his exploit and gains access to our machine pretty easily, right? We saw it happen in the last lecture. And it also took just a few seconds for an attacker to get access to our machine. So let's think about what would be the easiest way to prevent this. Well, if you said to patch and update everything on this machine, you are correct. We should update all the services, applications, and softwares that are running on the target machine and that are also exposed to the internet. This way, attacker can try to exploit our machine, but it will be unsuccessful. Most common targets to unpatch vulnerabilities are applications that communicate over the internet, outdated operating systems, and browsers. These are three main targets, and you should always make sure you keep all of them up to date, otherwise you may be exposed to multiple vulnerabilities. Okay, but besides this, what is another layer of protection that we can add to make it even harder for hacker to target us? Well, we can always add antivirus software and we can set up a firewall to protect ourselves, since firewall can filter all the incoming and outgoing traffic on our machine or network, and it can also notice if some request might be malicious and drop it right away. A good antivirus software can help in malware detection on the system, and it can also sometimes prevent live attacks or live exploits. Imagine that you actually did have a vulnerability on your system and the attacker tried to exploit it. A good antivirus software might actually catch this and prevent your device from running the attacker code. Besides protecting devices with all of these things, you should also share common attack knowledge with your employees in case you have a company. This can also be sharing knowledge with your colleagues or pretty much with anyone who can be a target to an attack leading to your important data being compromised. They should be familiar with phishing attacks, how to recognize one. They should know not to input any important data on an untrusted application or website. And stuff like not plugging in unknown USB device into an important system should be a no-brainer, but should also be mentioned since many people out there don't really know the possibilities of getting exploited. Besides that, developers of these apps and softwares that you are running should also be introduced to vulnerabilities. Every application in production should be tested for bugs before putting it up online, especially the user input parts of the application, since that is something that requires special attention, since user input is where 99% of the attacks can come from. Application should be able to process any kind of input and not crash or act as it's not supposed to act. And last but not least, the application should not have higher privileges on the system than it needs. There is no need for parts of application to run with root privileges if it does not require root privileges at all. Okay, this will be briefly about preventing vulnerabilities overall. But right now, in the next section, let's take a practical look at how a simple zero-day vulnerability can occur and how just one incorrect function in code can lead to an entire system being compromised. Alright, it's time for a little bit more difficult stuff. Now, in the beginning of this course and in the past few lectures, we focused mostly on demonstrating how different attacks work that black hat hackers perform, and we also talked a little bit about hackers themselves and vulnerabilities. Now, in this section specifically, not everyone will be able to follow since it does require some additional knowledge of programming and knowledge of what stack is and how it's used. But don't worry, I will leave some resources that you can take a look at and learn more about this stuff if you're interested. Okay, so what is this all about? Well, before in previous lectures, we mentioned something called zero-day vulnerabilities. And now we can take a look at how these vulnerabilities can be discovered. Of course, we will be looking at a simple example with simple code so everyone can follow, but you will still need some programming knowledge in order to understand what we are doing. We're going to look at one of the most common vulnerabilities that occur in code, which are buffer overflows. Buffer overflow is, in a simple words, a vulnerability where user input is required and stored in a limited size variable without the check whether the user input fits that size. If the code doesn't check if user provided an input that is within the variable size limit, then we have buffer overflow vulnerability, since I, as someone who controls the user input in that program, can submit input that is larger than the specified buffer. Now, this might sound confusing right now, but it will all be clear in an example that we will do. And don't worry if you don't really get everything that we say, since this is really out of the aspect for this specific course, but we will, however, show it just because zero-day vulnerabilities and exploit development are usually taboo topics in this field. We just want to show a simple example of this and how this works. Nonetheless, here are some resources that you can read if you want to get more into exploit development and discovering vulnerabilities with buffer overflow. So once again, before I share these resources, you will need two different things. You will need a little bit of a programming knowledge, and you will need a little bit of assembly knowledge. Knowledge of stack is also quite important, but you will probably understand it along the way. Okay, so right here I have a Rapid7 website, and this article right here pretty much just dives deep into buffer overflows. It explains how they work, what they do, and when they occur. It gives simple code examples, and most of the code will be written in C because that's where most of the buffer overflows will be discovered. And it gives a step-by-step guide into exploiting the buffer overflow for this specific code. Now, once again, if you don't know how to code, don't worry, just sit back and try to understand the main idea behind buffer overflows, but if you don't, it's all good, this will come with time. Second thing that we have is another website called triaxiom security, and it also explains what buffer overflows are. It does also have nice pictures, so here we have a stack image. You will also encounter a lot of times these things right here, such as ESP, EBP, and EIP. We will also see it in the next lecture where we demonstrate the buffer overflow. These are important to understand. EIP or RIP being the instruction pointers and EBP being the base pointer. If you don't know what these are, make sure you read about these two before you get into the next lecture, because we will be using it and abusing it. Okay? So the next thing that we have is packedpub.com, and this is a paid source, but it does show a cool image right here where it shows how a stack buffer overflow looks like. So there is a certain variable that is vulnerable to the buffer overflow. If we overflow it with A's, the saved EBP and the saved EIP are also going to be overflowed with bunch of A's. This way we simply control the EIP, and if we control the EIP, we also control the next code to be executed. Here are also some of the resources. So Secure Coding has an article on how to protect against buffer overflows. And if you don't know assembly language, I do recommend reading this book if you're interested in this stuff. If you're not interested, feel free to skip it, but if you want to learn exploit development, you will need knowledge of assembly, and then you can check out this book, which is decent for beginners. And last but not least, I want to show you this YouTube playlist of MIT course on computer systems security. Now, this is not really connected to the buffer overflows, even though they are covered in this playlist, but it's a really good playlist, MIT lectures devoted to computer security. It does take some prior knowledge, so I do advise on finishing this course first before diving deep into this playlist right here. Okay, nonetheless, this was just an introduction. I will leave all of these resources below in an article so you can check them out. And right now, let's get straight into showing an example of buffer overflow in a simple C code. Welcome back. It's time we show an example of a buffer overflow attack. Now, once again, just to mention, for this specific lecture, you will need a little bit of knowledge of C programming, of assembly language, of how the stack works, and just a little bit of Python as well. If you don't know all of this, you can sit back and just observe and watch this lecture and try to understand as much as possible. And if this is something that interests you, feel free to learn more about it from the resources that I left in the previous lecture. Okay, let's see how hackers discover vulnerabilities. And keep in mind, this will be a rather simple example. This is usually much more complex, since the code is usually a lot bigger than the code that we will use. So you will notice right here on my desktop, I have two programs, vulcode C and vulcode 2C. So we are going to try to attack both of them. We will just show a simple example on the vulcode C. So let me just open the program so you can take a look at it. And this is pretty much the entire program. Okay, so it has two functions. It has the main function and the read request function. Now, if you are experienced with C programming, you will notice where the error is right away in this code. So let's go through it real quick. The main functions allocates a variable integer called x, and the value of this x is stored from the return value of the read request. If we go to the read request function, it allocates a buffer size 8. It also creates another integer variable, and then it calls this gets function. Any C programmer will right away tell you that this is a vulnerable function, and we're going to see in just a second why that is. After the value returns, it simply prints the number right here to the screen. So we can test this code. Let me just first remove the executables that I already compiled, and let me compile this code, vulcode.c, and output will code right here. Now, the compiler will give us a couple of errors, and you will see right away that it gives us a warning for this gets function. It says use fgets instead. Down here we can read, warning, the gets function is dangerous and should not be used. And the reason why it's dangerous is because this function doesn't check for the length of input. It asks for input from a user. The user can specify any length of input that they want, and then it will get stored in this buff variable, which is the size of 8. So if the user specifies a larger input than 8, then we have a buffer overflow, just because the developer used this gets function. Even the compiler says use fgets instead, which is a more secure version of this function that allows the program to check for the user input. Nonetheless, our program did compile, however, and if we run it, it will wait for an input. If I type 1, 2, 3, it will just print x equals 1, 2, 3, which is this statement right here. If I go, for example, a, it will just print x equals 0 because it did expect a number, but I specified characters instead. Therefore, it didn't crash the program, but it also gave some incorrect output. And finally, if I try to specify more than 8 characters, let's say this much, we get segmentation fault. The program crashed, and this is due to this buffer overflow that we have right here. Okay, so let's take a deeper look into this. And to do that, we need to use something called debugger. For this, I will use GDB, which is a debugger that comes with Linux. And if I just type GDB and then the executable program, it will open it in debugger. And now I can read it in assembly language. So let me just enlarge this a little bit. And there are different assembly flavors, so I'll just set this assembly flavor to be Intel first. And now I can try and disassemble the main function, which will be this function right here. So this is how assembly language looks like. Now we will not be explaining the assembly because that would take some time. I assume that you do know it for this specific lecture. Keep in mind you won't really need it for the rest of the course. And pretty much it simply just allows us to manipulate with different registers, move things from one register to another, access the memory, and all of that. We can even recognize some of the things from the C function. So for example, we have this call right here, and then it calls read request. So this is pretty much here in this line when the main function calls the read request function. This is pretty much that exact same line. Someone trying to analyze this code would notice that this is not a regular function, so we can also try to disassemble that one as well. So disassemble readrec, which is also a developer coded function, and right away anyone that is experienced will notice this gets function being called right here. And they would already know that there is a high percentage that there is a vulnerability in this code. So let's straight away break at this function, which essentially means that once we start the program, it will pause right before executing this function, and then we can go step by step to see how it executes and also to inspect different registers. So once I set the break at the read request function, I can type run and the program will start. I can straight away check my registers by typing I and then space R, which will show me the values of all of the registers right here. Keep in mind the RIP register is important to us because it is the instruction pointer. It points to an address where the next code will be executed, which is currently this address right here. We can even confirm that by once again disassembling the read request where we set our breakpoint, and it gives us this arrow, so this is the next instruction to be executed. We're currently in the read request function. If I type next, it comes to the point where it asks for our input, and remember, if I type something larger than the size of 8, which is specified in this code, we will get an error. if I type IR, we will see something rather strange. So RBP, which is the base pointer, has a bunch of 41s inside of it. That is because we managed to overflow it with these A's. Take a look at this image from last lecture. So this is pretty much how it works. This is space for our variable, or in our case for the buff. Then we have the saved EBP, or in our case RBP. One is for 32-bit and the other one, which is RBP, is for 64-bit. And after that comes EIP, or in our case RIP. So ideally, we want to control the EIP. Now we need to calculate how much space our variables are using, and we need to calculate how much space EBP is also using. Then we will get to here, which is our EIP. Okay, so let's do that straight away. We know that we have two variables, right? Which is the buff, size of 8, and integer, which, if I'm not mistaken, is size of 4 in x64, and we can double check that by going to Firefox and typing size of int. Now keep in mind that different integer values can have different sizes. For example, there is short integer, there is long integer, and they will both have different values. Here we check the 64-bit size, we check the regular integer, and it's 4 bytes large. So we have 4 bytes of size for this value right here. And then we have the RBP, which is the size of 8. So all we need to do is put that together. So 8 plus 4 plus 8. And whatever comes next should be stored in RIP. Let's give it a try. So let's run the program again. We want to start from the beginning. We want to go to the next. And here is our input. Let's type 8 times A. This is for the buff. Then we will type 4 times B for the integer. Then we type 4 times C, or pardon me, 8 times C. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, the reason why here is 41, 41, 41 and not A is because A is actually the same thing as OX41. It's just in hexadecimal. So these are pretty much 8 times A. Now with this, we fill in the buff. With B's, we overflow integer value. With C's, we overflow RBP. And now, if I type 6 times D, these 6 D's should overflow the RIP. Let's give it a try. If I type I and then R, we see that C's overflowed RBP. And we also see that D's, which are 44, overflowed the RIP. So we successfully controlled what we want in the RIP. Okay, now that we did that, which is the basic part, let's try to actually exploit it with vulcode number 2. Let me just close this. I need to close this as well. And first of all, let's check what vulcode 2 even is. So I will open it. It's a little bit of larger code. It has 3 functions. And our goal in this code is to run the win function. So it has the main function with a simple if-else statement. It calls if test password, which then allocates a password variable with a size of 10. It asks us to input the password, and it uses once again the vulnerable gets function to do that. So we already know that there will be a buffer overflow right here with this line, because the password is limited to 10 characters. If this function is called, and it's called in 100% of cases, then it will print fail. In other times, it will print win. So if you look at this code, you will notice that win pretty much never gets called. There is no path in code where win is getting called after a certain line. This if statement will always work, so we will never get to this else win statement. So let's try to hack this program and get to this win statement ourselves. We already can have an idea of how we can do that. We already know that RIP is the instruction pointer, and if we somehow get the address of this win function in the instruction pointer, we can perhaps run it. So let's give it a try. Now, in order to remove all the possible stack protections that we might have and that might present us the problem when exploiting this code, we need to compile it a little bit differently. So I will run gcc-fno-stack-protector, then -z, execute stack, -nopy, and then I will use the code, which is woolcode2.c, and I will output it in woolcode2. This will compile. It will once again give us the warning for the gets function, saying that it's dangerous and that it should not be used and that we should use fgets instead. Now these compilers are good because they do give us this warning, but some compilers won't give you the warnings. Especially if you turn warnings off. You won't really notice this. Now let's run our code to see how it even works. It asks for our password. This is just the memory address or random memory address. And here we can type test and it will say fail. We can type test123. It will once again say fail. So pretty much there is no correct password here. It will always say fail. But let's hack it using GDB. We open GDB woolcode2. Once again, I will set the disassembly flavor to be Intel. You don't have to if you don't want to. This is just personal preference. And now let's disassemble the main function. The attacker can go through the main function. They can see that a certain function called test_pw is being called right here in this line. They can then try to disassemble that specific function. And as with the previous example, they will notice that gets function is getting called and they would straight away know that this program is vulnerable. Okay, once again, we notice gets. Let's put a breakpoint on this test_pw function and let's run the program. We can check the registers to see what else do they have. So this is the current value inside of the instruction pointer, and we can confirm it by typing disassemble test_pw. It will point to the beginning of the test_pw function, since that is where we put our breakpoint. This is the address where it's currently at, or this current instruction. If I go next, it will ask for the password. Here I can type anything, so let's go with bunch of A's, or let's go with uppercase A's, just so we can get those 41s once again in the RBP, and we get the segmentation fault. Okay, let's check the registers. The RBP is once again overflown with 41s. So what do we need to do in order to get our desired value in RIP? Well, we need to first overflow the password value, which is the size of 10. So we will use 10 A's for that. Now, since this is the only variable inside of this function, the next thing that we are going to overflow will be RBP, which is the size of 8 right here. And the next thing that comes will be RIP. Let's give it a try. Let's run this once again. Let's go next. So we go 10 times for the password size. We go 8 times for the RBP, and let's use letters B for that. And letters C will be in RIP. Let's check it out. Letters B, which are 42, are in RBP, as we wanted, and letters C are in RIP, which we wanted as well. So we successfully control the value of RIP. But how can we actually get and run this function? Well, all we need to do is we need to put the address of this function inside the instruction pointer. And this instruction pointer will then afterwards execute our function because it's pointing to its address. How can we find out the address of the win function? Well, we can type disassemble win. Here it is, and here is where it starts. So to craft our payload, I will use a help of a small Python program that I have. So let me open a second terminal. Let me enlarge it just so we can see everything better. And let me nano pyx.py. Okay, so here is the address that I previously used, which in this case will be this one. So let's copy it. This is the address of the beginning of the win function. Let's delete it, paste it right here. And here we actually craft our payload. So notice we have 10 A's for the password, 8 B's for the RBP, and the thing that comes after should be the address of the win function, since that is what we want to run. Now, if we just use this address afterwards, it will not work. Let me show you why. If I type run, press yes, click next, and then just type 10 times A, 8 times B, and then I put this value right here, you will notice that RIP is some random value right now. It's not exactly this, and this is what we want to have inside of it. This is because we're specifying a string. We need to specify bytes instead. And there is also something called little and big endian, so we also must reverse it in order to make it work. That's why our payload should be these bytes right here reversed. So x40 is first one, or should I say last one in this payload, x11 is in the middle, and x90 will be right here. This is simply just this address reversed. Now, if I save this, close it, and run this program, it prints something weird, right? But this doesn't matter for us. All we want is this payload to be specified inside of this program as an input. We can also run this Python program from the GDB if we wanted to by using this command R and then 3 arrows to the left, then $, open brackets, python2 -c, and simply -c stands for specifying the command between these double quotes, which will then be executed with Python. And all we want to do is print our payload, which in our case is, we already know, 10 A's, 8 B's, and then our address, which we can specify by \x90, \x11, and \x40, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just get the pyx.py, and here is the address. So 90, right here, 90 being the first one, we got 11 being the second or the middle one, and we got 40 being the last one at the end. Okay, so we specified the password, the RBP, and we also reversed the address of win function. Let's give it a try. All I need to do is close this with single quote after the print statement and with brackets at the end, and if I press enter, it will ask if I want to run from beginning. I will specify yes. Let's check the instruction pointers. So you will notice right now that nothing really happened yet, but if I type next, it will auto input our user input with our payload that we crafted with Python right here. Let's click next. And now if I type I and then R, we will see that RBP is overflown with B's right here, but we'll also see that RIP now has the address of the win function, which even says right here. So if we did everything successfully, if I type next, it should execute the win function, which, let's remind ourselves, prints you win. Let's give it a try. And here it is. It says you win. We successfully hacked this program to make it execute a function that it never really executes when run normally. We manipulated the registers, we manipulated the instruction pointer, and we put the address of this function in the instruction pointer in order for it to be ran. And we successfully did that. Now keep in mind this is a simple example, and we also turned off the stack protection, so in real life this is also a little bit harder to do than what we showed right here. But nonetheless, it's important that you understand in theory how this works. Okay, now that we covered all the known attacks that hackers perform, starting from running Trojans to a simple social engineering, from showing an example of a simple zero-day vulnerability, and in this case, if this was a program which is in use and we discover this vulnerability, it would be a zero-day vulnerability because this code has not been patched yet. Since we did all of this in details, let's also devote the next section into covering social engineering in details. And after that, we're pretty much done with this introductory part of the cybersecurity course, where we focus on different attacks and on hackers and vulnerabilities. See you in the next lecture.